Hey there, Nancy here, and welcome back to another episode of Entrepreneur Rescue Mission, right? Brought to you by our company, The Time to Grow. So, this episode, I'll actually be doing solo. I really wanted to get on and kind of share, right? So we've been talking a lot about thought leadership and, showing up authentically and, sharing your reasons why you do the things that you do. And it really inspired me to do an episode to really share my origin story, right? To kind of share with you guys a little bit more behind the scenes. So there's more context and understanding, right? Why we're so passionate about helping others show up authentically, build their personal brands, and especially, why we love to use LinkedIn as a place to do so, right? To create real connection. So, um, I also want to share this, and I want you guys to kind of put yourselves in the shoes of how you can share your story, right? Because I think our stories, and I call it your origin story because sharing your origin story can be so incredibly impactful because it can do so many different things, right? It can show people what's possible, like, oh my gosh, that person did this, I can do it too. It can inspire them. It can also make them feel like, wow, I don't have to be perfect. You went through all of this and you came out here, that's really good to know. Sharing your origin story can also help share your passion, share why you're so fired up about helping people in the way that you do, right? Because with everyone, who is listening, you are probably doing business of some sort, right? You either have a product or you have a service and you help people, right? Because most businesses, we solve problems. Well, the thing is people want help solving problems from people that they trust, from people that they can, know that they can go to and they can rely on them and they are, savvy and they know what they're talking about. And what I really want to share with you again is my origin story and kind of what I've been through that's put me on this path of really helping so many other people share and show up authentically, because I think it's really impactful and I think it's relevant, right? So that you guys understand, at least where I'm coming from. And, Scott has his own really incredible multi-layered story as well, of being a past gym owner and multi-million dollar business owner and so on and so forth. So, I want to kind of paint the picture, right? A lot of people, I think, when they make assumptions, right, they just look at someone and they go, oh, that person's had it easy, or that person, has just been handed, all the things and so on and so forth. And I think for me, life has definitely not always been easy. Even sharing my earliest, memories, right? In life, I know we moved a lot whenever I was a kid. My mom was a single mom, for a while. And, at one point we lived in a trailer park for a while. In fact, to be transparent, like those are some of my happiest memories as a kid because I remember, my brother and I just riding around on our bikes and hanging out with the local kids. I mean, I was even so young, I wasn't even like in school at that point. Actually, maybe I did go to kindergarten. I think I did go to kindergarten there, but it was so much fun because life was so simple, right? There wasn't a lot of chaos and craziness. I just remembered just nothing but great memories. And, once we finally kind of got settled, I just always realized as a kid, I was ADHD, full of energy, always talking, always getting my name on the board at school, because I was just always a ball of energy. I always had this grit and determination to do more, right? To push the boundaries, to get what I wanted, to set my sights on something and know that no matter what, I could get there. I just had to keep pushing it, And so once we actually, kind of settled down, it was about third grade, I was 8 years old. Before that, we had moved around a lot. So it was kind of hard to make friends, friends that I had gotten close with, I lost. And, it was really hard, as a young kid going through a lot of that. And when we finally got settled, life was a lot different, for many people. And, my parents were divorced and, it was a lot of separation anxiety, a lot of things that we went through, my brother and I very young, and it was a lot. But never ever in any of those moments, did I doubt that I was made for something more. I just felt it, that fire inside me. And so when it came time, whenever I was actually graduating from high school, I knew I wanted to go to college, right? My parents, we had never really talked about it as far as options. I knew that this was something that I was going to have to make a decision on, and I was going to have to figure it all out, So it was funny because it was my best friend, who was my best friend since I was 8, in third grade. She told me, she's like, "Nan, like you have to go away to college. It's going to be like the best experience of your life." And I remember thinking like, "Well, I can't. That's not for people like me. I don't have money. My family doesn't have money. Like this just isn't in the cards for me." And I just remember feeling like, you know what? Other people are doing it. It's happening. Like, this is what I want. I'm gonna just do it. I'm gonna go. And so, with, a few pivots and turn of events, I ended up after going to, community college for a couple years to kind of get my feet on the ground and to figure out what I wanted. I went away to school. And, it was probably the scariest thing. I definitely did have some arguments with my dad who had co-signed my loan, after telling him this is absolutely what I wanted, which puts a lot of pressure, right? Because I've got to follow through and I've got to get a job and I got to make sure to pay those loans off. And it was very hard. I know when I was in college, I mean, that first night there, I threw up. Like I threw up because I thought, oh, maybe I have food poisoning or something, but literally it was my body was just off the rails. It was like, oh my goodness, what have I done? I'm here now all by myself. I don't know anyone. I'm starting this new venture because this is what I want to do. And I was scared. And so I was in college and I ended up, obviously getting a job. I was one of the kids who I had to get a job. I had to make money. My parents weren't paying for things, all the time like so many other people's were. And, I had to really keep thinking like 5 steps ahead of where I was going to go after I graduated. I had to have a plan. And so I really put a lot of pressure on myself. And, there were so many times in my life where during this whole process, I had to really rely on what I knew, right? There wasn't a lot of guidance or people telling me, like, oh, this is what you should do. It was me kind of like figuring things out on my own all the time, right? This independence. And so when I was in college, actually, the first year, I did a career. Um, it was like trying to figure out what your major should be. And I remember taking the test, and I had gone to this college because I'm like, you know what? I've been a pharmacy tech for 6 years. I can go for pre-pharmacy and I could actually, become a pharmacist. And that was kind of like on my mind. But I took this test and it was supposed to help me figure out what your major was going to be. And I took the test and it said, you know what? You'd be great at marketing. You've got the brain for it, you're creative, you're also very business, you're entrepreneurial, like all these things popped up in this test. And I remember thinking, well, I could go to school for less time and become a pharmaceutical sales rep, right? Like that sounds pretty good. So I kind of started down that path, and I was actually so excited about the aptitude test, and the test that I took, that the career education department at the school offered me a job. They were like, Nancy, like, please help us get this out there. So I actually ended up promoting it at Business 101 classes and speaking in front of, large groups of students in those classes to try to help them figure out what path, right, they really wanted to go on. Because I know having the gift, right, of knowing what you're good at and knowing your strong skill sets and knowing the things that, you're more inclined to, having that knowledge is so powerful, right? It helps me be so much more authentic, and real, and know that I'm doing what it is that I'm supposed to do. And so I loved, right, teaching that and getting that out there, in the classes. also during that time, working with the Career Education Center, I was able to kind of get my foot in the door with some internships. That was a whole other thing, right? I think my parents couldn't grasp the idea that, oh, you can do an internship with a company and this is just going to give you such a bigger leg up, for when you actually do get a real position out of college. And so I knew this. And so I bent over backwards. I busted my butt. I flew all over the place. In fact, I remember at the time, like my GPA was not great, right? I was not the best student, right? I was very smart. I mean, I've always been very smart, but not smart as far as test taking and applying myself. Again, it's that ADHD kicks in. I did not like to do a lot of studying and writing and all that stuff. And I was always kind of like a cruncher the day before. But anyway, so my GPA was nothing to write home about. But I remember that I had interviewed for an internship, and this internship was a really big one. And I remember, the Career Ed Center saying, like, this is a big one, right? They really are aggressive with, finding the right people. And I flew to North Carolina. I ended up going through a series of interviews, right? There were dinner. It was a whole dinner series where we had to interact with, the higher ups at the company. We had to build rapport. We had to go through interview rounds, right? Where they asked me, like, do grades matter? Explain to me about GPA. We toured the, facilities of the company. We did all these different things. And I remember hearing that at the end of all of this, and I'm telling you, there were hundreds of us that went, there were a ton of people from all over the country. I made it in the top five. And hearing that news, I was pretty shocked. I was actually offered a position, an internship position in New York. And I didn't have the money to live anywhere in New York. I didn't have, I didn't have the means, right, to do any of that. So I had to turn that down, and it was for a sales manager internship position. And so after being offered that, I mean, I was so excited, but I was also so like, this is what I need. And what ended up happening is, I came on as a sales rep within the, one of the lower, more local markets. And then probably 2 weeks before I actually started that particular internship, they called me and said, we have a sales manager position. We actually have a whole new market in the Philadelphia area. It's our biggest market. We're going to put you in this role. And so behind the scenes, right, I am jumping up for joy. I am so excited. I'm like, F yeah, like this is all this hard work, all this interviewing, which to be honest, I don't even know if my dad or my mom or like, I don't think they really knew what I put into this. And quite honestly, even my friends, like, I don't think they really knew, at the time, all the things that I was doing. And so it was a lot of behind the scenes, really hard work. Okay. And I ended up taking the position. And I remember, right, it didn't pay very well. In fact, I was probably spending more, in parking tickets and parking fees, each and every day, trying to get my team together and get them motivated to get out there and do sales. And this was types of, like, guys, this is like door to door selling ad space, okay, in what is like the yellow books, okay? So it was not easy. It was a lot of work. And, it really wore on me and it was hard. And, week after week went by. And, again, I was getting pressure from my parents, like, you need a real job, like, stop this, like, you're not making any money. This makes no sense. And, it was just a lot. And so I was doing this knowing that I had my sights on more. I had my sights set on more. I knew what I wanted to achieve, and I was going to do everything that I could to get there. And what happened, right? I like to say we get thrown out of the nest sometimes. And what happened is my car, literally in the middle of the city, I get this alarm on my car that my car is overheating. And at the time, I drove a Sunfire, I drove a stick shift, and I was like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? And I'm in like back-to-back traffic. I get off of the main street that I was on, and I get on the highway, and I'm driving, and I'm just trying to get far enough so that I could get on the shoulder. And by the time I got to the shoulder, I was drifting. My engine had shut off, and I was drifting. And I pulled over and I just started crying. right? I just started crying my eyes out because I'm thinking in my head, no, like I know what I need to do. I know I've got to keep doing this, but without a car, without extra income, without the means, right? Without the support of my parents, without all of those things, I wasn't going to be able to continue, doing this internship. And so I had to quit. I had to quit. In fact, my car ended up being totaled. The engine pretty much melted or blew up or whatever. The tow truck driver was like, "You want to give me some money? I'll just roll it off the hill, down into a ditch for you." And I'm just like crying my eyes out, like how awful. And I ended up leaving that internship and I felt so defeated because I'm like, man, someone like me, right? Humble beginnings, like, how dare I? I had this self-doubt that would creep up and this imposter syndrome that time and time again would cyclically show up, limiting beliefs, right? Things that would bring me to my knees and make me feel like, no, you're not good enough. Like, you aren't meant to do more. Like, you are meant to stay right where you are. And this was one of those moments. And what I'll tell you is, I found a job, went back to work, kind of worked the rest of the summer, and then I went back to school. And I just, again, I felt very defeated because this had happened. But I set my sights on the next thing, right? My actual roommate had got, this job with a company. And she's like, you know what? In 2 years out of college, you can make six figures. And again, I was like, yes, this is what I needed. I just needed the roadmap. I needed to know what I needed to do in order to pay off my loans, right? I was figuring things out. I'm like, well, how much is this going to be? How am I going to be able to move out of the house and be able to do all this? And so I said, well, I want to do that too. So I made it a non-negotiable in my mind that I needed to interview. And that company at the time was actually Target. I knew I had to get a job at Target and I had to hit these numbers and I had to bust my butt in order to do all the things that I needed to do to pay off my student loans, to build my life, to move forward. So that became my North Star. And what I just want to share with you guys is at no point in any of this, right? Were things easy. In fact, trying to get an interview, I kept getting told no, or I kept, missing an opportunity, or this person ended up quitting. I mean, I actually, for one of my interviews for an executive at Target, I drove 3 hours. And in fact, my car at the time, I had bought, a Jeep Cherokee off of an ex-boyfriend, and the thing was a piece of garbage. The air conditioning did not work. The thing had like shoddy suspension. It was like a death trap. Anyway, uh, I drove 3 hours from school to go to this interview without air conditioning. I mean, I am sweaty, disgusting mess. I show up, I've got a little suit jacket and like suit and pants, and the person who was supposed to interview me had quit. I think it was like that day. And I didn't get to do my interview. And I was so angry. And again, right, these limiting beliefs popped up and this thought, this is just not going to happen. I was told no so many times. I was told no way more times than I was told yes. I ended up getting another interview. I explained to them, look, I'm driving from really far. I just need to make sure this is happening. I end up showing up. I end up going through the interviews. I end up getting through and I get offered a position. This is out of college, right? Finally, with Target. And that's where my everything started, right? And I went down that road of working really, really hard. I set my sights on, well, I want to go from being an executive, managing this team to leading and running the store, right? And managing the entire executive team, pharmacy, operations, like logistics, like HR. I want to be like in charge of everything. And then again, in the future, I want to continue to work my way up the ladder and then manage, multiple multi-million dollar stores and so on and so forth, right? This was like my goal because I knew if I could get to, manage stores, I could make six figures. And again, I could pay off my student loans and I could eventually be free, right? I could eventually start enjoying my life. This did not completely work the way that I planned, but at least for a few years, what I will tell you guys, it definitely gave me hope and it pulled me out of feeling like I couldn't do it. I mean, I developed skills I was able to learn so much, the whole time. And kind of the transparent part of this that I want to really share with you is the whole time in these leadership roles, when I was sitting in rooms with leaders who, had managed thousands of team members and people and just people that I looked up to, I remember feeling so often, oh my goodness, I hope they don't find out who I am, that I'm an imposter, that I'm not supposed to be in this room, that I'm just this person who is, faking it. I'm just working really hard because I don't have money and I need to have money to do the things that I want to do, eventually. And I remember feeling that way all the time, and my confidence level, right? I just really was not confident in decisions that I made. I asked for a lot of advice, but I wouldn't, actually come up with, my hard truths. It was always, learning something from someone else. And it wasn't until, right, pretty much like a whole domino effect of things happened, that really set me on the path of realizing that, living your life with purpose, but living authentically and being yourself and showing up as yourself and having core values and foundations that you can put your feet down and rely on and know, this is me. Um, is probably one of the most amazing, incredible pivots that you can make. And I do believe, right, it doesn't matter what position you're in, right? You could be a sales rep, you could be a business consultant, you could be a health insurance broker, you could be, an artist, you could be anything. But when you are staying hidden and you are hiding, right, the truth that is you and who you really are, and the things that you put your foot down about, and the things that you know to be true, and the core values and the way that you are authentically, right, when you put yourself out there and you share that with the world, everything changes, right? Life gets easier, building your business gets easier, being yourself, being authentic, right? I think it was a podcast episode that I actually listened to. So, actually, before I even share that, I want to share with you the domino thing that happened, which really threw me out of the nest. And that was, I had started working so much, that my family stopped inviting me to holidays. I actually would work, Christmas Eve. I would work on Thanksgiving. I was working so much that I wouldn't even get an invite. Okay. And I hated it. I was so upset. The holidays for most people were such a fun time. I started to hate them. And what happened is eventually, I hit a point. I actually went into work. I was closing that night. I was working a later shift. And I got a phone call, and it was the phone call that something was wrong. And that was actually the night that I found out that my dad had been in a motorcycle accident. Um, my dad, who was actually fairly recently retired. I mean, it had been a couple years since he had retired, and he had worked night shifts and he had worked so much. And I got the call that in one day that was gone. Right? He had passed away. He had gotten into this motorcycle accident, and all the time that I thought that I had with him was suddenly gone. It was taken like, a rug pulled out right from under me. And I remember leaving, right? Because at the time, I called my boss and I said, I gotta leave. I gotta go. They came, they took care of it. And that moment that my brother and I got the news officially and we realized what had happened, I remember just thinking in my mind, fuck this. I'm part of my French, but when something like this happens in your life, you really wake the hell up because you start thinking, what is this all for? I had worked so hard to prove what? Okay, yes, to make money so that I could pay off my student loans, so that I could make sure my dad, would be proud of me and, see that I'm capable of all this and so much more. What's it all for? And at that moment, I really, truly lost my North Star. I lost my purpose. I lost my way. life and energy left my body. And instead, I feel like I started to erode. And every day that I was not myself and I was doing something that was so against my purpose, it felt icky and it felt awful. And finally, it felt so awful that it just something had to change. And so to me, finding something where I actually could spend time with family and I could be myself and I could show up authentically became my number one priority. I thought it was another position. I ended up leaving Target. I went to Apple. That was 10 times worse. In fact, it was just awful. It was so not me. Um, and that was it. I was done. I mean, I was thrown out of the nest by my own physical breakdown. I mean, I was so tired, exhausted, overworked. My body, I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism, which later, I found out it was Hashimoto's. I had sent my body into a full-on breakdown. And I do feel, years later, about 5 years ago at this point, I think I was diagnosed with kidney cancer. And I full-heartedly believe that that is because I ran myself into the ground like that. I pushed myself and I broke my body. I felt like something broke. And at this point, um, I just was done. I was like, I'd rather just drive my car right off, the side of I'm just done. I don't want to do this anymore. And the fact that I had all these student loans and I had all this stuff in front of me, I just thought to myself, you know what? I'll freaking figure it out. I'll figure it out because I can't continue. And so what happened is the domino effect went off of, I'm done. I actually went away. My mom's always been very entrepreneurial. She is an artist. We went away for actually this glass fashion show. It was like this amazing, like fun event that she had arranged, and I was helping to kind of project manage it. And at that event, I'm like, I want to do this. I want to do things that fill me up. I want to do things that let me feel like I'm in the right place. I want to do things where I don't feel like I am giving up my soul. And it was that weekend, I just said, you know what? I'm done. I'm quitting. I'm going to start my own business. I don't care. Like all the details, I didn't quite have them ironed out, but I said, I'll freaking figure it out. So I went in. Actually, no, I didn't go into work. I called my boss and I said, I'm done. I said, she just asked me to write the reviews, for all the team members to wrap up loose ends, things like that. I did it and I took an entire month off. And for most people, I think you're probably thinking, oh my God, that's scary as hell, right? Because at the time I did have a mortgage, I had bills, I had my student loans, which were at least 500 plus a month, and my mortgage was like 2,100, right? So I had bills and I did not have a lot of savings. I had maybe my 401k, I had some things, that I had as a very light cushion for a short period of time. But I took an entire month off to just rest. I took a month off to rest, to regroup, to form a game plan of what I wanted to do. I ended up reading a Reddit article about a house cleaning business that an accountant had built from the ground up, and he was making six figures. And, he laid out the game plan. And I was like, I'm going to do that. And so after, the month, which I spent a week with my brother and his family, I spent a week with, my mom, my stepdad, and like I literally took time out to just be, you know. Um, and I put my game plan together and I met with a score.org mentor through the Small Business Administration. Actually, highly recommend them. They're amazing. I started, really putting a solid business plan together. I created my website. I started diving down, and using feedback from my mentor, get your hands dirty, get your hands in this business, see what it looks like to actually build and create this business because you'll be able to manage your team better. I follow this through everything that I do. Right? For everybody who's listening, for every business that we have ever done or built, or we teach people how to, it's like we have done the dirty, dirty, dirty work. Okay. We have done it. We've built things from the ground up. We've hired, we've made mistakes. We've, had to learn. We have had to pivot. We have gone through the bumps and bruises, and that's why we are so passionate about sharing things, in the way that we have. And I had to learn these things. And whenever it came to building my house cleaning business for a period of time, it was very scary. There were times where I was a puddle on the floor and I was crying my eyes out, thinking, what the hell decision did I make? You know, what did I do? Like, how dare I try to go down this path? And I had more things that were thrown my way, guys, taking money out of my 401k, tax bills, things that were adding up, right? Things that I didn't think about, right? Because this was my first business. Crippling things, right? That put me into, again, more sickness and kind of this spiral of like, oh my goodness, who am I, to try to do this? After constantly, right, realizing that yes, there are going to be obstacles, there are going to be things that are thrown in your way, that are being thrown in your path, knowing that you can overcome them. Guys, I full-heartedly believe anyone, you can overcome it, right? It's part of earning your stripes and earning, this thing. That's why not everyone can do it, right? It's staying on your path. It's staying true to what you truly want. When I was a puddle on the floor, I remember, I'd started renting out rooms in my house, right, to make ends meet. I was getting very scrappy. And one of my roommates at the time said, Nancy, I admire you so much. Are you kidding me? Like the fact that you quit your job that was bringing in six figures, it was bringing you in a healthy income to literally putting your chips all in on yourself and building a business where you could work when you wanted and you could build it as big or as small as you wanted. And, doing this, like, holy shit, that's amazing. And that's always been, right? Like, yes, that is the point, right? I want to build a business that gives me freedom, flexibility, all those things. And so building my business became a game. What do I have to do to grow my client base, right? I've got to get this many clients in order to make this amount of money to pay my bills. And I just kept pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. And when days got hard, I kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And what happened? We grew the business to six figures a year. We grew the business to a point where, I came out of a hole. We grew the business to a point where now I could start paying back, back taxes, things like that. I grew that business to a point where eventually I could shift focuses and I could truly start doing, right, the marketing work, right? Rewind back, we look at the stepping stone. I had taken that assessment and marketing was such a big passion, right, for me and something that I'm truly, definitely good at and, that I have a really great skill set for. I got to stretch those skills. I got to enter the world of digital marketing. I started my agency, which is BYOB Agency, Build Your Online Brand, which we mostly work with health insurance brokers now. It's all about helping people show up authentically, right? It's not about posting generic content. It's actually taking your thought leadership and showing up authentically. Okay. In the time to grow, right? This business that Scott and I run together, we do business strategy, business consulting. We help you build your personal brand. We help you show up authentically, right? Be seen as the thought leader in your space. Show up as you. Okay. Work with clients you want to work with. Build a business that feels good. This is where this all comes from. Okay. What I want for myself, I want for everyone else. So, this is my origin story. This is the path that it took to put me on doing what it is that I do. And I'm so grateful that I'm able to look back and I'm able to see those little stepping stones. But what I want to now challenge you guys, and I want to kind of, turn the mirror around, and I want to say, which, by the way, since all of this, I've paid off my student loans. Okay. In fact, I did that a few years ago. I became debt free. I now run, multiple businesses and I'm making way more than I ever was doing any position that I had ever done before, probably all combined. And I'm working less and I'm working in more passion and joy than I ever have. And so I want to turn the mirror around with you guys and I want you to share, why is it that you do what you do? What is your origin story? What were the building blocks and the things, that are part of your past that have led you here? Because those things are impactful. Those are connecting points. Those are chances for you to help, right? You bridge some of these gaps and get to know others. Because at the end of the day, right, I'm sharing this, you could be watching the video or listening to it on a podcast, but I'm sharing it with you because this is my story. This is what led me to getting to where I am. This is why I'm so passionate about helping you guys show up authentically. I talked about it before, right? I had listened to a podcast episode while I was cleaning, actually, with my house cleaning business. And it was a leadership podcast. And they shared that one of the biggest things that people regret on their deathbed is not living a life true to themselves, right? Not living in their purpose and instead living for what they thought somebody else wanted. So I want to put that out there twofold. Are you living in your purpose? Are you doing the things, right, that light you up? And number two, are you putting yourself out there authentically? Because I'll tell you what, showing up as the real you, not sugarcoating it, not hiding it, not trying to be perfect. My God, no one is perfect. We are all a work in progress. It's so much easier. And that's what we need more of. So that is the end of this podcast. Got raw and real. But I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Again, we advise you, right? Get out there and share your story. And if you need some help doing it, right? That's what we're all about. So you can check us out at thetimetogrowcom. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you next week.